Ladies and gentlemen, we might make a start just with pressing timetables, so thank you very much for your understanding. For those who popped in for the book launch, I'll introduce myself. My name is Andrew Blythe, Group Manager of the Public Leadership Research Group in Howard Library. On behalf of our Director, Professor David Lovell, we welcome you to the official book launch of The Art of Coalition, the Howard Government Experience, 1996 to 2007. It is indeed our pleasure to have Peter Dutton with us today, and as is our custom, we will have Peter speak, and then we invite Mr. Howard to say a few words, and then Professor David Lovell, and then what we'll ask is for those chapter contributors who are with us today to come up and have a selfie with Mr. Howard, and then we will end our proceedings from there. So I will make a start. Ladies and gentlemen, Peter Dutton delivered his first speech as the member for Dixon on the 13th of February 2002. During his speech, he reflected on his time as a Queensland police officer and small business owner before being elected to Parliament. Peter said, and I quote, "I was a police officer for 9 years. I often say to people that as a police officer, I've seen the best and the worst that society has to offer. I have seen the wonderful, kind nature of people willing to offer any assistance to those in their worst hour. And I've seen the sickening behaviour displayed by people who frankly barely justify their existence in our sometimes over-tolerant society. I'm proud of the fact that I had a distinguished career in the police service." Peter then spoke of his lifelong values and philosophical beliefs. And he said, "I had always had an interest in politics. And to me, the Liberal Party was a party founded in many ways on the principles of individualism and reward for achievement. It goes without saying, of course, that these are principles from which I have benefited and always defended with great conviction. Further, as leaders and representatives of this country, we must facilitate an informed debate. It is my aim to use my experience both in small business and in law enforcement to provide a more practical view on some of the issues and problems experienced in these areas." Peter concluded his speech by saying he would advocate for the rights of individuals and for minimalist intervention by government in people's lives. Over the next 20 years, Peter was to be tested by serving in portfolios as diverse as workforce participation, Treasury, health and sport, immigration, home affairs, and defence. Peter is the 15th leader of the Federal Parliamentary Liberal Party and 35th leader of the opposition. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Peter Dutton.
Andrew, thank you very much. Firstly to you and David, thank you for putting together a fine publication. Thank you for the work in honouring John Howard, the Coalition, and a few points that I wanted to make today. But firstly, to all of my former colleagues in the room, it's great to see you here, Richard, Mal, others who are here, Georgina representing the Downer family, no doubt, but also to all of our staff. I'd like to make a special mention of the staff who were an integral part in the success of the Howard years and contributed to the success of the Coalition. And as I look around, there are many people that have been able to fill that very heavy duty and to fulfil it very well. And I think sometimes we don't pay due recognition to the staff and the support that they provide to us. I feel as John, as your last minister in the Parliament, I almost feel a little like one of the sort of the Japanese holdouts. I've sort of resurfaced from the jungle today to recognise that the Howard government did actually come to an end. I'm here to celebrate what was a wonderful government, but led with great courage and conviction by John Howard, and in the case of the National Party by Tim Fischer, by John Anderson and Mark Vaile. As Tony Abbott in his contribution to this book rightly sums up, essentially the Howard government flourished because it had character, convictions and courage. Now that is an indisputable conclusion, and the contribution of many of the ministers and the staff, as I point out, to John's success as Prime Minister, to the success of the Coalition, is something that we don't relish enough. And to see the words in this book, The Art of Coalition, and to have the story told on a more regular basis is something that we should all commit ourselves to. There's some remarkable people that form part of this success story. And as John Howard said, and I quote, "It was a prime example of the Nationals putting the good of the coalition ahead of their own immediate political gains. It was one of the reasons that I would become impatient with those Liberals who begrudged some of the concessions I made to the Nationals on policy questions dear to them. There had to be more give and take in the coalition." Of course, John was talking there about the Nationals' pragmatism and leadership and courage in relation to gun reform, but it could equally apply to many other parts of decision-making that was evident throughout the course of the period from 1996 to 2007. We know in relation to the respect that each man had for one another was an integral part of this story. Mr. Howard once said of his second and longest serving Deputy Prime Minister, "I liked him from the start. John remains one of the most genuinely decent people I have met in public life." And John Anderson, as we know, served for almost 6 years as National Party leader and as Deputy Prime Minister. In that time, Howard and Anderson built a coalition that was more united, more cohesive, and ultimately more successful. Their partnership began a decade before Anderson became National Party leader. When John Anderson delivered his maiden speech in 1989, Mr. Howard approached him, shook his hand, and remarked, "I enjoyed that very much. I like having my prejudices reinforced." Now, in government, of course, Howard and Anderson resolved coalition tensions and delivered outcomes for their constituencies respectfully and without public disunity. John Howard had a remarkable career in many ways, but the influence of Menzies is, of course, well documented. And the relationship between Menzies and Page means that John Howard was ultimately a much greater coalitionist than even Menzies. And the work that John did in a pragmatic way to learn from the Menzies experience, to learn from his own horrific experience in 1987, meant that he was somebody who came to the job with every reason to dislike his National Party colleagues and every reason to walk away from or to diminish the impact of a coalition. But of course, as history records, he has done the complete opposite. And this book, through the various contributions, goes to that very significant record. So I want to touch not just on John Anderson, but of course Tim Fisher at Tim's funeral not that long ago. Many of you would have been present, and the respect there for that man was palpable and something that we should all be very, very respectful of and very mindful of. He contributed in a very significant way, as did Mark Vaile. Mark was also a very decent person, a very strong coalitionist, and worked very closely with John Howard. The fact is that the Howard government achieved an incredible deal for our country over 11 years. It didn't come to be by luck or by chance. It came to be because of the courage of John Howard, the support of the team around him. It came because of the bravery of the three National Party leaders. And the Howard government succeeded because the Liberal and National parties worked together. Their leaders understood and appreciated the give and take the coalition government required. Our party and our country owe Mr. Howard, Mr. Fisher and Mr. Anderson and Mr. Vaile a great deal for their personal efforts in working constructively in the national interests. Their example reminds all of us as leaders of the parties today to ensure that the coalition not only survives but thrives. It is well and truly in the best interests of our country that we do have an effective coalition. And the example set by these men reminds us that if we do want to deliver for Australia, we first must master the art of the coalition. John Howard, again today, we pay tribute to you for your work as the leader of our Liberal Party, the leader and the inspiration behind the success of the coalition. And I'm very pleased, very proud to be here with you today. David, again to you and to Andrew, two champions of getting this story out and telling the truth of the Howard years and documenting it in a way which does a great service to the Howard legacy and to the memory of the government and to the work of the Coalition. Thank you all very much for being here today.
Mr. Howard, would you like to say anything?
Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is the first occasion publicly that I've had to congratulate Peter on becoming leader of the Liberal Party of Australia, leader of the opposition, and of course the leader of the Coalition. I think it's the first time we've had two people from Queensland leading the two parties at the same time. And as somebody who bears absolutely no state of origin prejudices, I get into trouble with my staff. They say, "You're a closet Queenslander," and I said, "Look, those Queenslanders certainly when I was around knew how to vote, and you don't expect me to barrack against them in a state of origin." But Peter, I'm very proud of what you have achieved. You brought into Parliament a pragmatic set of principles, and that those two words do fit together more naturally than many people think. There's often a tendency to say, "Oh, if he's pragmatic, he's not very principled." Pragmatic principles means that you stick to your principles when you have a real chance of succeeding, even though things go very badly at first. And I found in the work you did in the various portfolios I entrusted to you, and then later on, of course, my subsequent leaders of the Liberal Party, a capacity and a grit and a determination. I know when you first go into opposition, it's pretty bleak. I went through that in 1983 when the Fraser government was thrown out. And then, of course, I didn't experience in Parliament going into opposition again because I got thrown out when my government was thrown out. And so it was an entirely different experience. It's not easy. But there is a surprising upside. When I look back on my experience in politics, I can think of two occasions when I was pretty dismal. One of them was in December 1972. My wife and I had just taken our leave of the then defeated Prime Minister Bill McMahon at his home in Dromalvin Road, Bellevue Hill, and we went around to the home of the then president of the party, John Atwell, just around the corner, and we sat and contemplated what might happen over the next 3 years, and we were reconciled to long years of Labor government. And of course, the rest, as you know, is history. Within 18 months, I'd been fortunately elected as a member for Bennelong, and then 3 years later, Fraser won the greatest victory anybody's won. And I think also to Kevin Rudd's defeat of me, I feeling a bit depressed that night. I wasn't entirely surprised with the result, but we all know what happened then. This idea that it's perpetually dismal in opposition is largely true, because you should try and get out of it as quickly as possible. But there's often a surprising upside in the experience of being in opposition. But finally, can I just focus on what is the central core of this book, and that is the importance of the coalition. I was a very passionate coalitionist, and probably the most traumatic 18 months of my political career was the Joe for PM campaign, when for the first time in my lived political experience, that coalition was being torn apart by provincial madness. And it's something that I've never forgotten, because it taught me the truth of the adage that there's no more deadly, ugly war than a civil war. And that was a civil war. It was a civil war inside the National Party. I mean, in the end, it was stopped by the character and courage of the New South Wales National Party, because they refused to campaign for the Queensland National Party if they stood against any Liberal candidates. And that was an act of great loyalty and decency. And it just drove home to me how tremendously important that coalition was. And I reflected on what it meant to Bob Menzies. I can recall way back in the 60s, a redistribution proposal was being put up, and in those days I don't think the boundaries were drawn quite as independently, and there were things called rural weightings and everything, and McEwen just said, well, you know, this is unacceptable, Prime Minister, and Menzies got up in Parliament and said the redistribution will not be going ahead, and he made certain, of course, that the interests of the National Party, the Country Party, were protected. And I can remember how Malcolm Fraser, to his great credit, would say to the Liberal Party in Victoria, if you run a Liberal candidate against Peter Nixon, who I have to say is one of the most able, astute, talented ministers I've ever sat around a cabinet table with, if you run candidate against Peter Nixon in the National Party held seat of Gippsland, I will come and campaign, not for the Liberal candidate, I'll campaign for Peter Nixon. Now that was a measure of the determination of Liberal leaders to preserve the coalition, and it's been more than repaid by the loyalty and support of the National Party, and the strength of my government was very much in the unity between the two parties. And woe betide any Liberal in future who talks about breaking away from the Nationals. Of course they have their prejudices, but so do Liberals. And I've heard just as much nonsense from some people in the Liberal Party on policy as I've heard from the Nationals. And I can see Peter grinning, and he knows exactly what I'm referring to. I would say long live the coalition. It's helped deliver us government. Very importantly, I applaud the partnership between Dutton and Littleproud, two determined Queenslanders who I think will give great representation and will articulate the fundamental values of our two parties. And Peter, I wish you and Kirralie great good fortune and good health, and anything I can reasonably do to help you, I certainly will. Thank you.
Scott, you might want to put your jacket on. Ladies and gentlemen, it's our pleasure to provide a copy of the book to the following chapter contributors. Chapter 3, The Coalition, 1987 to 1995, A Marriage of Convenience, Dr. Scott Prasser. Thank you. Chapter 10, The Coalition and the Privatisation of Telstra, Professor the Honourable Richard Alston. We'll get it back from you. Chapter 5, The Coalition and Gun Control, Professor Tom Frame. Chapter 8, Dividing the Spoils, Portfolio Distribution, John Howard. And returning to Chapter 1, The Challenges of Coalition, Professor David Lovell. I now invite Professor Lovell to say a few words.
Thank you, Andrew. I will be very brief because I'm standing between you and lunch. I have only two tasks here today. The first is to urge you earnestly to buy the damn thing. It'll be available at the end of the room shortly, so please buy a copy. The second is the usual thank yous. Certainly thanks to Peter Dutton for coming in today to launch the book, and for, of course, Mr. Howard for his constant support for the Howard Library and for this book as well. Andrew mentioned this morning Professor John Nethercote, who passed away last month. John was a very important part of our community in the Howard Library and in Australian politics more generally, and he did a lot of editorial work on this coalition book, so I'd like to pay thanks to him. Our own Howard Library team, Annette Carter and Trish Burgess, also worked on editorial and on the production of the book. I just want to let you know that the effect of the Howard Library, the exhibition we have, the publications we make, the annual conferences and other seminars and so on, are done on the smell of an oil rag. We have effectively 2 full-time staff. So all of this, all of the production we have here is the result effectively of 2 full-time equivalent staff. And I am very, very proud to have been part of that team for the last 2 years. Although this is a little unscripted, my term as head of the director of the Howard Library comes to an end next week. I am retiring after nearly 40 years with UNSW. And I have to say the last 2 years with the Howard Library has been some of the most enjoyable times that I've had, in part because of the productivity, in part because of the support that we have from the people around us, our editorial advisory board and so on. And also I want to pay a special point of thanks to Andrew Blythe for his co-editing the book with me. Actually, he did most of the work, to be honest. And also to our respective partners, to Andrew's fiancée Dominique and to my wife Christine, who's put up with a lot over the last 40 years. So thank you very much. Have lunch, buy the book, and thank you both for coming today.
Oh, one last gesture, if I may, Peter. If you can get through these this afternoon, please. There'll be a test at dinner, but it is our delighted to have you here. So thank you so much.